Beyond the stars we can see lies an invisible battlefield. While the world focuses on terrestrial conflicts, a silent, high-stakes competition is unfolding in Earth's orbit. Major powers are deploying classified military satellites at an unprecedented rate, transforming space from a realm of peaceful exploration into a contested warfighting domain. Today, we'll explore this hidden space race, examining the technologies, geopolitical implications, and the potential consequences for humanity's future beyond our atmosphere. In recent months, defense analysts have identified a dramatic shift in space activity. Unlike the visible space race of the Cold War era, today's orbital competition operates in the shadows. According to the Secure World Foundation, at least 37 suspected military satellites were launched in the first quarter of 2023 alone, with China, Russia, and the United States leading this surge. What's most concerning is how little information has been disclosed about these satellites' capabilities or purposes. We're witnessing a fundamental transformation of space from a sanctuary for peaceful exploration into a contested military domain. The stakes couldn't be higher, as nations compete for strategic advantage in what military planners call the ultimate high ground. Perhaps most alarming are the new satellites with advanced maneuvering capabilities that can change orbits unpredictably. These inspector satellites can approach other nations' space assets without warning, potentially for surveillance, interference, or even attack. The U.S. Space Force has recently acknowledged tracking unusual orbital behaviors from several unidentified objects. These satellites have demonstrated abilities that far exceed civilian technology. They can accelerate, decelerate, and change orbital planes with remarkable precision. Imagine a scenario where a satellite suddenly diverts from its expected path and approaches a critical communications or intelligence satellite. Without clear international protocols, such maneuvers create dangerous ambiguity. Is it a benign inspection, an intelligence gathering operation, or preparation for an attack? This uncertainty increases the risk of misinterpretation and potential conflict escalation. Today's military satellites represent a revolutionary advancement beyond their predecessors. Modern systems incorporate technologies that seem pulled from science fiction. Optical camouflage materials reduce visual and radar signatures, making these satellites harder to detect and track. Quantum communication systems offer theoretically unhackable secure channels. AI-driven autonomous decision-making allows satellites to operate independently when communications with Earth are compromised. Micropropulsion systems enable precise orbital adjustments that were impossible just years ago. Most concerning of all is the development of what experts call fractional orbital bombardment systems, satellites capable of carrying conventional or nuclear payloads that can deorbit on command to strike targets on Earth with little warning. Russia tested such a system in November 2022, though officials described it merely as a peaceful space research platform. These technological advances have fundamentally changed the strategic calculus of space operations. The commercialization of space has inadvertently accelerated this military competition. Companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and dozens of smaller aerospace startups have dramatically reduced launch costs while increasing payload capabilities. What once cost tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram to launch now costs a fraction of that amount. This economic revolution has enabled military powers to deploy more hardware into orbit than ever before. The technological democratization of space has blurred the lines between civilian and military applications. Dual-use technologies have become increasingly common. High-resolution imaging satellites ostensibly launched for environmental monitoring can provide military-grade reconnaissance. Satellite constellations designed for global internet coverage could be repurposed for military communications or even as weapons platforms through simple software updates. This dual-use nature makes regulation and verification extraordinarily difficult. The miniaturization of satellite components has further complicated monitoring efforts. CubeSats, small satellites often no larger than a shoebox, can now perform functions that once required spacecraft the size of a bus. Their small size makes them difficult to track and potentially enables major powers to deploy constellations of hundreds or even thousands of military assets without detection. Defense analysts estimate that up to 40% of CubeSats in orbit may have undisclosed military functions. A single rocket launch can now deploy dozens of these small satellites simultaneously. Their low cost means they can be mass-produced and rapidly replaced if destroyed. This creates a resilient network that's much harder to disable than traditional large satellites. The proliferation of these small military satellites represents a fundamental shift in space warfare strategy, from reliance on a few high-value assets to distributed networks of smaller, redundant systems. The surge in military satellite activity has created significant diplomatic tensions globally. At last month's United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space meeting, representatives from 24 nations called for new international frameworks to govern military activities in orbit. The existing legal framework, primarily the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, was drafted when satellite technology was in its infancy and contains significant gaps regarding modern capabilities. It prohibits placing weapons of mass destruction in orbit but remains silent on conventional weapons systems, anti-satellite capabilities, or dual-use technologies. China and Russia have jointly proposed a treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, while the United States has advocated for a non-binding code of conduct. Neither approach has gained universal support, leaving a dangerous regulatory vacuum as capabilities advance. This legal ambiguity has fostered an environment where nations can pursue increasingly aggressive space policies while maintaining plausible deniability. This legal ambiguity has enabled nations to take increasingly provocative actions while avoiding responsibility. When India conducted an anti-satellite missile test in 2019, it characterized the operation as a demonstration of technological capability rather than a weapons test. Similarly, when China destroyed one of its weather satellites in 2007, creating thousands of pieces of dangerous orbital debris, it initially denied responsibility before later claiming it was testing technology for removing space junk. The absence of explicit international norms has complicated diplomatic responses to such provocative actions. When a Russian satellite maneuvered unusually close to an American intelligence satellite last year, the U.S. had few diplomatic or legal recourses beyond issuing statements of concern. Without established rules of the road for military space operations, the risk of misinterpretation and escalation grows exponentially. Each test pushes boundaries further, establishing new norms of acceptable behavior that other nations feel compelled to match. Beyond security concerns, the militarization of space poses significant challenges for scientific research and environmental monitoring. Astronomers have already raised alarms about how the proliferation of satellites, military and civilian, interferes with ground-based observations. The European Southern Observatory reported last week that approximately 30% of images from their Very Large Telescope in Chile now contain satellite trails, up from just 5% in 2019. Military satellites, which often operate without published orbital parameters, create additional complications for observation planning. Astronomers must now contend with unpredictable interruptions to their observations, potentially compromising years of research. Furthermore, the risk of orbital collisions increases with each new satellite. A collision between active satellites or with existing space debris could create thousands of new debris fragments, potentially triggering a cascade effect known as the Kessler syndrome, where debris collisions create more debris, eventually rendering specific orbital ranges unusable for generations. This environmental concern extends to potential weapons tests in space. Anti-satellite weapons demonstrations, like those conducted by China, Russia, and the United States, have created significant debris fields that threaten all space operations. A full-scale conflict involving space assets would likely render key orbital regimes unusable for generations, effectively denying humanity access to space for scientific exploration, communications, navigation, and climate monitoring. The Kessler syndrome represents an existential threat to all space activities. Once triggered, the cascade of collisions would continue independently, potentially creating an impenetrable shell of high-velocity debris surrounding Earth. The consequences would be devastating: no more satellite communications, GPS navigation, weather forecasting, or climate monitoring. Space-based astronomy would become impossible. Even the International Space Station and future crewed missions would be at risk. What makes this scenario particularly alarming is that it could be triggered intentionally as a strategic move during a conflict, a form of scorched earth policy applied to orbit. As nations continue to exploit space's strategic high ground, the scientific community and international diplomats find themselves in a race against time to establish norms before a crisis occurs. The outcome will shape not only international security but also humanity's collective future in space. Several promising initiatives have emerged in recent years. The Artemis Accords, though primarily focused on lunar exploration, establish essential precedents for responsible behavior in space. Similarly, the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on Reducing Space Threats has made modest progress in defining what constitutes threatening behavior in orbit. Commercial satellite operators have also begun advocating for international standards, recognizing that orbital congestion and militarization threaten their business models. Industry-led initiatives for space traffic management and debris mitigation offer templates that could be adapted for security applications. These efforts represent important first steps, but much more comprehensive agreements will be necessary. Preserving space as a domain for peaceful activities will require unprecedented international cooperation. Just as the Antarctic Treaty successfully demilitarized an entire continent during the height of the Cold War, a new framework for space security could establish boundaries while allowing for legitimate national security activities. The Antarctic Treaty provides a powerful precedent. It transformed a potential flashpoint for conflict into a global commons dedicated to scientific research and environmental protection. A similar approach to space would recognize the legitimate security interests of major powers while preventing the most destabilizing activities. This would require establishing clear red lines, prohibiting debris-creating tests, banning weapons that can destroy satellites, and creating notification requirements for close approaches. Verification would be challenging but not impossible. A combination of ground-based sensors, space-based inspections, and transparency measures could provide sufficient confidence in compliance. The alternative to cooperation, an unconstrained military competition in orbit, risks geopolitical instability and could close the final frontier to human exploration for centuries to come. We stand at a crossroads. One path leads to space as a domain of conflict, with critical orbits rendered unusable by debris and nations viewing each other's satellites with suspicion and hostility. The other path envisions space as a realm where competition exists but is bounded by rules and norms, where scientific exploration flourishes alongside security activities, and where humanity's collective future among the stars remains open. The decisions made in the next few years will likely determine which path we take. The stakes extend far beyond national security interests. They encompass humanity's ability to monitor climate change, communicate globally, navigate precisely, and ultimately expand beyond Earth. Our generation's choices about the militarization of space will echo through centuries, potentially constraining or enabling our descendants' relationship with the cosmos. The hidden space race unfolding above our heads represents one of the most consequential yet least visible security challenges of our time. As China, Russia, the United States and other powers deploy increasingly sophisticated military satellites, the character of space itself is changing, from a scientific frontier to a contested warfighting domain. The technologies involved, from maneuvering inspector satellites to potential orbital bombardment systems, have outpaced international law and diplomatic frameworks. Meanwhile, the commercialization of space has democratized access while blurring the lines between civilian and military applications. The environmental consequences are equally concerning, with the specter of the Kessler syndrome threatening to cut humanity off from space entirely. Yet there is hope in emerging international initiatives and the precedent of the Antarctic Treaty. The path we choose now will determine whether space remains open for peaceful exploration and scientific discovery, or becomes another battlefield that ultimately denies humanity access to the stars. The militarization of space is not just a security issue, it's a decision about our species' future beyond Earth. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for updates. Your feedback is appreciated. We hope to see you again.